This is Mae Brussell. This is broadcast number 597, May 16th, 1983. I want to say that before the program goes on, with this regular broadcast and the tapes that go out by subscription to other stations, we are doing a half-hour radio talk show here, and it's really nice. I'd like to extend it to more time if Kazoo has it later. And if you like it, call the station and let them know. It's really nice to answer your questions and get feedback and add things that I forgot to mention, such as the broadcast coming up of Charles Manson and the Nazis. So keep in touch and let them know at Kazoo if you want some more of this or more time. I'll give the time and share it with you. Now into the news of the week. I forgot to bring in my broadcast, the page that goes with the broadcast a year ago today. So next week we'll double up. There was so much news I actually forgot to do it. First article of importance is secret Pentagon intelligence unit is disclosed. We don't have enough of those, but this is the treacherous one. Beware. And remember, you were forewarned. This is from the New York Times, May the 8th, 1983. This is a special unit of operations separate from the Defense Department, separate from the CIA. This is called the Army Intelligence Support Activity. It has more power separated from the other two. Now, this was formed in 1980, but its role just came out recently when James Bo Gritz, Gritz, that former Green Beret, went off to Laos, and it turned out he was acting, in quotes, independent, and supposedly was given something like $40,000 from Clint Eastwood, who lives up here in Pebble Beach. He was part of this secret Army department. Now, I haven't had time yet to do a broadcast on Mr. Bo Gritz, but I have an article of his and some descriptions of what he did in Laos, and he said, I don't mind if I start World War III. Now, the headquarters for this group, of course, is Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I'm not going to backtrack and tell you about the Nazis that came from Nazi Germany that set up Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and the Army Special Forces. Those were Hitler's Nazis, just as if you brought Himmler and Walter Rauff and SS Wolf over here. Hitler's Nazis set up a special division in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and I told you also the information I had and pictures and diagrams of Mr. James Frankenberry stationed at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and his role in practicing for what was to be the murder of John Kennedy, the crossfire, and the shooting in the window of General Walker that had a lot of subtle reasons for shooting him and not killing him that I'll go into later, the Walker shooting. Now, these people worked with the General Dozier kidnapping. That means they work with the Red Brigades. It means they work with Henry Arsan, A-R-S-I-S-A-N, who's part of Banco Ambrosiano and the largest drug gun smuggling assassination team in the world that also worked with the JA and the P2 Masonic group in Italy. These are the fascists from Italy because the Dozier kidnapping and the release was set up by these people, and the Pope shooting that involves Edwin Wilson and Frank Churchill, who work with the Green Berets and Special Forces, and Mr. Duberstein, who was murdered just 2 weeks ago from the CIA to the Defense Department. And incidentally, he also was involved in the narcotics division. And the narcotics area is the group that's being exposed or should be getting the headlines of Henry Arsan, the Vatican, the Milan Mafia, gun smuggling, narcotics, and assassinations. They are located, as I say, in North Carolina, and the code name for this group, dig this, is the Monarch Eagle. The Monarch Eagle. You know, I was talking to a friend today, another researcher and student of history. She said in Poland, the eagle has the crown on top of it for Poland. But the minute I read this, I thought of the Romanovs and the Habsburgs, who do want to get back on their throne someday, and Mitchell Bell, the White Russian, who supplies the weapons and the silencers for these assassination teams. What a title in the United States Army, the Monarch Eagle. As I put on the printed sheet that accompanies these tapes by subscription, the Monarch Eagle has replaced the Stars and Stripes. Horrendous story, superseding the CIA and FBI. Another story in the San Jose Mercury, May the 8th, U.S. dispute rages over secret wars and presidential powers. And this is for a San Jose Mercury story on how far can Richard Nixon and Mr. Richard Pipes from Harvard, his name isn't Pipes, he's Polish, he changed it so he wouldn't associate like Brzezinski, and you wouldn't have too many Poles running the Cold War, going into the hot war. This is an article on how much power, how many secret wars. Remember, Henry Kissinger had a secret war in Cambodia, and Kissinger and Kramer are still calling the shots. They have wars in El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, the Honduras, everywhere in the world, and the countries that they achieved what they wanted, like Argentina and Brazil and Chile, are all going bankrupt. There's a story in the paper today, Chile's economy was better under the Marxists than the Chicago Milton Friedman system. Anybody could figure that out. Just sitting home and reading 2 books, you could figure that one out. Another scandal in Australia, similar to the Pentagon Papers here, Australia halts the disclosure of papers on the CIA links. Now, somebody in the Australian government, in the Australian Security Intelligence Organization, has exposed an infuriated Prime Minister Robert Hawke, the new Prime Minister, of papers going back to 1970, how Australia was sold to the United States. This is during the time period also of the Nugan Hand, at the heart of the Nugan Hand Bank, with their dope dealing and their death squads coming in from Southeast Asia and using the Australian banks. They're trying to stop these papers. They've cut them off. They say they're an embarrassment. It will involve Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and they have silenced any more than the first paper coming out, the allegations of the CIA involvement of Prime Minister Gough, G-O-U-G-H, Whitlam, W-H-I-T-L-A-M. They got rid of him in November 1975. The CIA did, and runs the government there. And these papers were given to the equivalent of the FBI in Australia on how the United States has running prominent Australian figures for many, many years. Now, of course, this Hawkes, I believe he attended Harvard, too. He's another person who attended Harvard. He has put a lid on that. Story out of Dallas Times-Herald. Dallas JFK exhibit will recall the past. This has to do with the anniversary of John Kennedy. In Dallas, Texas, 2 people, Linda Lynn Adams, Lindalyn Adams, and Conover Hunt Jones, have put $2 to $3 million into rebuilding the Texas School Book Depository. They're going to show you the walk from the staircase to the window where Oswald stood. Oswald didn't stand at that window, and there's no proof that he was there. They're going to show you the 6th floor room to relive the past where a spent rifle cartridges were and scattered books boxes. Those could have been spent and scattered at any time up on the 6th floor. They're going to try and show you for their $2 to $3 million the window out of which Oswald shot when the fatal shots came over the grassy knoll in the Daltex building and crossfires that killed Kennedy. They're going to have a newly built outdoor elevators and a skywalk to carry visitors to the 6th floor. Oswald was never seen on the stairwell going down, and the elevator was broken, and immediately after he was having a Coke on the 2nd floor when the police entered. They're going to show you all the things about Lee Harvey Oswald so that you are sure once again, 20 years later, this is where John Kennedy was murdered. Now, they've turned down an offer for the hearse that carried Oswald's body to the cemetery. They said no thanks. But other than that, they're going to relive for you another lie, another day, so what? That you can see it visually. That will make it more interesting for you. Another story, the court in Los Angeles has tried Robert M. Takasugi, Takasugi, the judge, has tried to lock up all the papers on John DeLorean, and there was a lawsuit by the Associated Press and various news media that you cannot lock up this information, that there may be discrepancies or lies, and the news media sued because the John DeLorean case is so top secret. Now, remember, when he took on Joseph Ball as his attorney from the Warren Commission, I knew that it involved the CIA and probably the Odessa network going from the Vatican to Ireland and the spy network. So there was, anyway, a lawsuit challenging the right of this judge to lock up all this information, and they want it. And interestingly enough, one of the judges on the appeals panel was Stephen Reinhardt, Reinhardt. And when he was recommended as judge in Los Angeles, there was a lot of discrepancy and argument because Mr. Hauser, the main witness of the FBI Abscam probe, said that Mr. Reinhardt worked with the organized crime and with various crime syndicate members, and they tried to get him off the panel appointed as a judge. He got the appointment, but he voted in favor of opening up these papers. So you never know which way these cases go. I would have guessed that he would have suppressed them if DeLorean is tied into the international narcotic gang. But the judge said, along with two others, open up the case. And one of the first things they found when they opened it up was John DeLorean's links to the IRA. Well, that again goes to the Otto Skorzeny network and Edwin Wilson and Frank Turple and Mr. Samuel Cummings in London, and the preponderance of weapons sold by our intelligence agencies and the use of his motor company and his connections. He hardly was ever in Ireland at all. The interesting thing is that the British banks, the Queen of England and the British banks, loaned him many $1 million to open the factory. So I could see where they'd want to lock up the fact that they used the money and worked with the IRA. So anyway, the case is going to be a little more available. The information is available. And I want to do a lot more on DeLorean. I have a lot of good stories. I want to update that because I did a few broadcasts and we haven't even had a chance to update it. And several weeks ago, I did mention the Stanford faculty and the Hoover Institute. And this is one of my favorite places because of the preponderance of the fascists in this particular Hoover Institute and their influence on the campus. And I mentioned it 2 weeks ago and a little bit on the broadcast, the program we shared just before this broadcast began. The faculty are objecting, the students are objecting, and what they're calling it is, they use the word, it's like a monarchy. They're taking people from the Hoover Institute and putting them on the faculty of Stanford University. They had a hearing this week, and the institute, known for its conservative leadership, is making the campus angry. And they said that they're putting their members from the Hoover Institute into the faculty, and the department is becoming, they use the word, like a battleground of these particular conservative people influencing the way the students think, where they want a more open mind. And they did compare it to a monarchy, which was pretty interesting. So this battle is continuing. It isn't a one-time shot, and I mentioned this for you. Now, one of my favorite subjects and not my favorite people, apropos of education, and then leading into the remainder of the broadcast, I want to talk about the Howard Hughes story and the links to the John Kennedy assassination, continuing on who really killed John Kennedy. Cambridge, Massachusetts had a mini demonstration of Japanese and Jews who objected to John J. McCloy setting up a new German-American scholarship at the university there at Harvard. Now, if you want to know about John J. McCloy and you don't know enough about him and you don't have my broadcast number 584, that was February 14th of this year, and 585, which was the following week, February 21st, I did quite a bit on John J. McCloy, and one of the items of his horrendous career was that he was the man behind Henry Kissinger's career, handpicked along with Fritz Kramer to put Kissinger in Harvard and then into the Defense Department to start our military coups, warming up with the Shah of Iran, putting him into power, and the Nazis and the Pahlavis, and then moving on to influence all the other major foreign policy decisions through the ages. Now, John J. McCloy has gotten a funding for Harvard from the Volkswagen Corporation, of all things, Volkswagen Foundation of Hanover, West Germany. $2 million will start the trust called the John J. McCloy Trust. And what he's going to bring to Harvard is 10 German students each year, scholarships to Harvard. 10 Germans are going to come to Harvard. Now, if you think what Henry Kissinger did in Cambodia and Laos and Chile and Brazil and the Dominicans and Peru and go to Jonestown and Guyana and the Middle East, look at the Middle East today, the countries that are about to be decimated and maybe to trigger an atomic war, and the death of Mubarak in Egypt and the long list of murders in Pakistan and all over the world. I mean, the numero uno killer, making decisions of killing Henry Kissinger, traveling around. He was appointed at Harvard by John McCloy after the war and given the scholarship by Harvard over there. Imagine 10 little Kissingers. Now, are they screened? Are they children of the SS? Are they the children of Goering and Goebbels? Are they the children of the Hitler Guard? Who are the 10 that are going to be going to Harvard every year from Germany? Can you imagine them? If Mr. Pipes came from Poland and the Harvard Department of the Soviet decision-making influences our National Security Council, our State Department, can you imagine 10 Kissingers every year breeding those? Well, that's what happens when you don't use any malathion on those people to begin with. When you don't spray them out and use their gases like they use on other people, you get they're breeding like flies, and they're going to bring in 10 Germans a year. There at least should be some description of their background and family, and were they in the SS. An example of continuing with the families, there's an article in the Houston Post last week, May the 8th, on Mr. Jaworski. Leon Jaworski was active supporting the Nazis. He was at the Nuremberg trials laying the top Nazis off. He was on the Warren Commission and covered up the Nazis and the organized crime syndicate. He was at Koreagate, covering up the payoffs of our congressmen and the entire buying off our Congress by the Koreans, and with Reverend Moon. He was head of the Senate Watergate Committee, covering up the major crimes of the CIA, even the plane crash of Dorothy Hunt and the Howard Hughes connections to Bibi Rebozo and Richard Nixon and the Chappaquiddick affair. Leon Jaworski, he dies this year. So after he dies, what comes? Another little Jaworski. His name is Joe Jaworski, and he lives in London, and he tells about in the 1970s, he was thinking there was a lack of leadership in this country, so he wants to take on leadership like his father, Leon Jaworski, the special Watergate prosecutor. He said, our country used to be viewed as a world leader. People were concerned that we're not acting with his leadership. So now he comes back to Houston, Texas, to get top people like Jesse Jones, the banker and lawyer James Elkins Sr., the same ilk as Leon Jaworski, and he's touching bases now with new people. He's in Houston. It's late 1980. He's armed with grants from the Houstonian Foundation. He's returned there, and the M.D. Anderson Foundation, that's the CIA foundation that his daddy worked with. He quit his law practice and creates an institution about the leadership of the nation. Now, in his endeavor, he says he has Thomas Cronin, Cronin, an author and political scientist at Colorado College. John Gardner, former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. John Gardner was one of those men that was on the institution, the Rockefeller Institute, set up for Henry Kissinger at Harvard that I spoke about last week, the military Defense Department people, and how Henry Kissinger could meet regularly with them and influence and taint their thinking. John Gardner was one of those, so now he's going to be at Houston. It says this is the beginning of the American Leadership Forum, a nonprofit Houston-based organization supported by corporate largesse, that's corporate profit ripoffs, LARGESSE, that's known as taking your money and getting it tax-free to form their think tanks. And Jaworski will be the forum's chief executive officer, and he'll open chapters in Hartford, Connecticut, and Atlanta, and 25 cities within the next 5 years. And he has a fellow who came in from Los Angeles who's going to help him, Mr. Krasny, Krasney. Mr. Krasny's from Los Angeles. He brings in that element, the old Lincoln Club and the old J. Walter Thompson. And Krasny joined this forum last year after leaving his job as Los Angeles consultant to Atlantic Richfield. And he's one of 18 people chosen, mostly in their 40s. The year-long program calls for fellows to spend 25 days in forum activities, including lectures, seminars, an outward-bound trip to Colorado, and schedules for the summer. So you get rid of one Jaworski, he dies off, little Leon goes to the great beyond, and what we end up with is another Jaworski, Joe, right? Same CIA foundation, same people, same thieves, same liars, taking over the country. They got a lot of kids, and they're going to pop up with the funding, the education, the think tanks, and take over this country, or they have it, just continue it. Now I'm going to, for the remaining 40 minutes, talk about a segment that has to do with who killed John Kennedy and how it was covered. But to me, it is the most interesting aspect of the entire assassination syndrome. We could do 1 hour a week for 52 weeks and not exhaust it. But next week, I'll give you a list of books on Howard Hughes. I'm talking about the Howard Hughes organization. I will get back to the Young Americans for Freedom with the Joe McCarthy story and Colonel Willoughby and Robert Morris. I have so much information on that, and that all links to Howard Hughes. And I want to do some more on the Hitler Diaries. That is far from dead. I've got some amazing articles and stories for you. But because of the obituary of Chester Davis this last week, I can't pass up the opportunity to talk about Chester Davis and the Howard Hughes organization. It's timely. Not only did Chester Davis pass away, he was the attorney for the Howard Hughes empire, and then several years ago they siphoned him off after Howard died. He was still in charge of the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in Florida, which is the entire profits of the Hughes aircraft with their billions of dollars of contracts from the United States government. He's a pretty important man. But the non-notice or the little attention that was paid to his obituary is absolutely shocking, because sometimes when a prominent person dies like this, you get front page stories. I've never seen a person of such great importance to America and to the business world and mentioned in so many books get so little space and following 4 days after he died. Now, Richard E. Sprague, S-P-R-A-G-U-E, wrote a book called The Taking of America, 1, 2, and 3. And he wrote an article in 1976 for People in Pursuit of Truth called The Power Control Group and How It Began. And he lists 16 items of the Power Control Group, starting with the assassination of John Kennedy and then controlling Lyndon Johnson, then moving Johnson out and murdering Robert Kennedy. But the point that's missing in the takeover of America is what preceded John Kennedy's death and then the continuity afterwards, because the secrecy of the Hughes organization, as I say, is the most amazing phenomena of the entire era. I don't think there is anything to equal it in American history. There were no secrets on Hitler, on how he came to power or where he was every day or what he did. But the secrecy and the power of the Hughes organization is absolutely amazing. Now, there are 3 states bickering for the Howard Hughes will to settle it right now. One is Texas, in Houston, Texas. The other is in Nevada, and the other is in California. But the very week that they are going to start making these decisions with a, it quotes, impartial judge from Michigan, from Detroit, Michigan, Mr. Chester Davis died. Now, the Houston Post had a story 1 inch, just 1 inch. Here's a man where the Hughes Empire, running the Hughes Empire, the Hughes Tool Company from Houston, Texas. He sold it in 1972, the year after I said was Howard's demise, and they pretended he was still alive. He was active financially in Houston, Texas, because they're fighting for the will and the probate to be in Houston, Texas. Here's the whole story from the Houston point of view. In the middle of a page where the obituaries are and a lot of small columns, former Hughes lawyer dies. Chester Davis, personal attorney to Howard Hughes for the last 16 years of the late billionaire's life, died at the age of 72. Davis, a native of Rome, Italy, was suffering from heart problems. He died Thursday in his sleep at his thoroughbred horse and dairy farm near Unadilla in central New York. Unadilla. It's very funny. Chester Davis milked the American people for 15 years plus, 15 of Howard's life, and then on to the present. Certainly it pertains to the Howard Hughes case from 1960 to 1983, and he dies on his farm where he's milking dairy. It's a dairy farm. So he goes from milking us to milking the cows, and that's what he does best, is milking. Okay, San Francisco Chronicle, just before I came on the air last week, such a little notice on page 19 that I passed it up on the obituaries. To tell you the truth, I think I'm a good reader. I missed it. David Emery called me and said, did you see Chester Davis died? And this was about the same story, that he went to work in 1960 for Howard Hughes, and he was general counsel of the vast business interests, heavy equipment, aviation, hotels, gambling, casinos, and real estate. and he helped run the Howard Hughes Medical Institute in Miami, which owns all the stock to the Los Angeles-based Hughes aircraft. There's a little bit more information, because if you ever heard of anything the Howard Hughes Medical Institute does, it's a giant ripoff for the Hughes aircraft that goes to the Institute. Have you ever seen a scholarship or a grant or anything they've done to make life or science better? I haven't seen its name in the medical journals of any place, yet it's the total tax deduction for this huge, huge institute. Okay? Another story, the Los Angeles Herald-Examiner. Now, the Hughes Corporation, the Summa Corporation is in Irvine, and there's one in Van Nuys. There's a large corporation in Irvine, California, the Romaine Street, with the headquarters, the multi-electronic control system on Romaine Street, the aircraft in Santa Monica. California person, Los Angeles Herald, again, about 3 sentences, that he came from Rome, Italy. He died on his dairy farm. At the time of his death, he was the executive for the Medical Institute, which owns all the stock in the Los Angeles-based Hughes aircraft. Just a couple of sentences. And the New York Times always does a little bit better. Chester C. Davis, lawyer, is dead, high associate of Howard Hughes. And then it tells how he was the general counsel and was in charge of the Summa Corporation, the major holding company. He was a director of Mr. Hughes' holding company. Incidentally, Howard's name wasn't on the Summa Corporation at all. They formed that, these dogs, took it over and formed it and didn't even have Howard's name on it. Sold the tool company, formed the Summa Corporation. If Howard lived or died, there's not a thread of evidence, and I will read you some documents next week. Some of these holdings and corporations, they hadn't had board meetings since 1943, totally private, and got together and did their own shenanigans. It tells how he helped with the legal battle of TWA. Now, that is an interesting story. He came in, and Howard's dream was to own TWA, and through a lot of finagling, Howard lost the TWA airline, and Chester Davis was the attorney for Howard Hughes. Then there was 535 million buckaroos, and these scheming people took that profit and take a man, not a man visible that you can see or fingerprint or know or recognize. Davis didn't see him. Robert Mayu didn't see him. Nadine Henley, for the last 15 years, didn't see him. Nobody saw him except 2 nurses who said it was Howard. And they took $535 million and took a train into Las Vegas on a Thanksgiving night and started buying up the town. The skimming money, the politicians, Senator Cannon, Paul Laxalt was the governor. This was the slimiest transition. And I'm going to give you a year-to-year move on how this took place, including the umbrella for the political assassinations and how they were done under the supervision of these people. Mr. Chester Davis, according to this obituary, in 1968 was in a Wall Street law firm of Davis and Cox. Then another firm merged, Jacobs, Persinger, and Parker. It tells how he came to the United States. His mother married a man named Chester C. Davis, and he took his name. Chester Davis became an American citizen in 1936 and took his stepfather's name and called himself Junior. Went to Princeton and went to Harvard, graduated in Harvard in 1936, and kept up his ties to Harvard and Henry Kissinger and the whole gang. Then we get into the Kramer-Kissinger. He was the Princeton, Harvard connections and the mafia connections from Italy. The Lucky Luciano and the John Rosselli, the whole gang merged with Robert Mayhew. He was the important man because he was the Wall Street attorney, the Harvard graduate, the Princeton man who helped Howard lose the TWA. I don't say purposely, but Howard lost it. And then Howard was lost too after that. So with all the cash, Howard wasn't seen, and these people kept this empire going and going and going. Now, there's a new book out. We have about 1 minute. Now, I haven't seen the book. I just want to tell you about it. It's called The Attorney Conspiracy by C. Terry Klein, Jr. The blurb says, why would the deputy director of the CIA assassinate the richest man in America? Does that whet your appetite? I'm going to try and get it because I'll bet you it is about Howard Hughes. Now, we'll take a 1 minute break and then get back to the subject of Howard Hughes, the American assassinations. send in a small amount, a large amount. We're going to side 2 of broadcast number 597, May the 16th, 1983. This is Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California. As I say, there is this new book out, The Attorney Conspiracy by C. Terry Klein, Jr., written by the author of Missing Persons and Damon. And this has to do with Congress, the KKK, the KGB, the FBI. What would be the motivation? The book says it's incredible. And also Howard Hughes was in the news this week, the same time that Chester Davis died. There were 2 articles. One, 3,000 people line up to gawk at Hughes' goose. Howard Hughes had the spruce goose. That was his dream, to make a wooden airplane that would fly. It's a very impressive airplane. It cost the taxpayers about $23 million, you know, the spruce goose. If you think that's a bargain, it flew 1 minute and $25 million, and it cost $1 million to keep it. It was bought up by a private group like the Queen Mary, and you can go visit it, but the money won't go back to the taxpayers. He flew it 1 minute, we paid $1 million a year to house it. It cost $25 million to build. It went up in the air 1 minute, just 1 little minute, November the 2nd, 1947, and that was it. And boy, you really get your money's worth. If you wonder why there's no housing for the poor, that's socialism. See, this is free enterprise to be able to do that. Now, the day that they announced that that Chester Davis had died, May the 9th, there also was a story in the San Francisco Examiner. New round in winner take all battle for the Hughes estate. $1 billion question, and this has to do with settling this large estate. There's 22 blood relatives. There's close, between the first cousins and others, there's 366 people that want to be included, and there are 36 purported wills of people that they ruled out. There were 36 wills. This estate, they want to probate it in California. We would get many millions of dollars, $100 million or more, if it's in California, if it's ruled in favor of California. If it's in Nevada, there's no taxes at all, and if it's Houston, Texas, the taxes would be less. The Texas people claim that he was on his way home to Houston. Of course, yeah, that thing was dead in Mexico, but they said he was coming home to Houston. He paid his taxes there. His tool company was there. He enrolled in the Army, enlisted from Houston, and they said that was his home. He really wasn't there. He built his empire in California, and the aircraft company and the Romaine, the Summa Corporation, et cetera, is in California. And for the most part, he was in California. When he went to Nevada, he was out of his head and never seen if it was him, and there's a question if it even was him. Now, when this case first came up about California or Nevada or Texas, I had contacted Ken Corey, who's the controller of the state of California, and he flew into Carmel and was at my home with several people. And what I wanted to say was that California could get the $100 million because he was kidnapped in California. He was taken by John Rosselli of organized crime and Robert Mayu of the FBI and CIA to a hospital in Boston from the Beverly Hills Hotel and never seen again. And if he chose to live in California, did he choose his own kidnapping? Because after that, after he was heavily drugged and supplied by drugs by Jack Eggers of the Beverly Hills Police Department and the crime syndicate and the police from LAPD and Beverly Hills and the whole drug connections, if he was drugged out of his head, the last place that he wanted to live was where he was lived before he was drugged. If that's what he chose when his mind was free, then anything made after that didn't matter. But, of course, nothing came of it. And I said, just investigate Vance Cooper. Find Vance Cooper, who is in that grave in Texas, and find out then who kidnapped, exhume that grave. And if it's Vance Cooper, which it is, find out who kidnapped Howard and show that it happened in California. Therefore, the $100 million belongs in California. But you won't get schools or hospitals or raises for teachers or anything for California because they're not going to open up that grave and show you it's Vance Cooper. There'd be too many higher-ups involved, and it would all be too scandalous. Well, the Howard Hughes story, I suppose I should just begin with a brief chronology and go into some of the details and specifics and the important era, the overlapping history, like I like to do, to set the framework of who was Howard Hughes and why is he so important. Howard Sr. was born in 1869, and he graduated from Harvard, got a law degree, sat down at a kitchen table one night and invented the oil tool bit that broke into the hardest surface of the earth. And Mr. Getty and various oil people, the Rockefellers and the Doheny's and everyone else agreed they would have been nobody without the tool bit. The Howard Seniors formed the Hughes Tool Company and invented a bit that went through the hardest surface of the earth and had the rights on it, so they had to rent it from him. Therefore, they were responsible for all oil drilling that followed after that. And Howard Jr. was born 1905 on Christmas Day. He went to a prep school in New England, getting ready for Harvard. He didn't like it. He went to a school in Ojai, California, became close to an uncle, Rupert Hughes, the writer, and his mother died in 1922. He was young, and his mother died in 1922, and it affected him tremendously. He was just 17, and Howard Sr. died 2 years later. A young man dropped from a heart attack, and redoing the history, I really wonder whether he was murdered, because the tool bit and the tool company came in the hands of the people who were later to literally not only rape this country, but rape countries all over the world with their power and strength and weapons, and they didn't give a damn about anybody. And so the thing hanging between Howard Jr. and any sanity of a child who was a prodigy in making engines and airplane parts and so forth, and he was a genius at that and at flying, the thing standing between taking him and his tool company and everything was Howard Sr. And 2 years after his mother died, Daddy drops dead, and Howard goes to court and gets proves that he is able to have and buy off the relatives to get 100% of the tool company. When his mother died, she left 50% to Howard. That was part of her investment. And she was from the Rice family. And he married, Ella Rice, later, prominent family. But his mother was Gano, G-A-N-O, family prominent in Houston. And Howard was left an orphan. And he shortly afterwards married Ella Rice, a prominent family there. And then along came a very nice big brother, Noah Dietrich, who had worked for Otis Chandler in Los Angeles. He'd worked for Doheny Oil. Doheny was involved with the Teapot Dome scandal and political levels that he had worked for them. And he went to Howard Jr. and said, well, hey, kid, I can help you. He writes a book. He comes and helps Howard. Here's an orphan. Just coincidentally, Howard has the tool bit, and he's left orphaned, and he's not going to be able to have control of the estate. And Dietrich goes to court and says, hey, I can, help with him. I'll take care of the tool company. And he takes over the Hughes Tool Company and literally takes over the entire business for Howard and gives Howard everything he wants in terms of airplanes, RKO Studio, the Starlets. Well, he didn't get Katharine Hepburn. He wanted her, but he had Jean Harlow and Jane Russell and a bevy of the beauties. And he did his airplane inventions and flew around the world, a hero like Lindbergh with his record of flying around the world. In 1924, Noah Dietrich comes in. In 1933, he was well into the Howard Hughes empire. Chester Davis was naturalized a couple of years later back there in New Jersey. And Raymond Holliday soon joins the Hughes Tool Company in Houston, Texas. He was in the Navy in World War II, and he joins the Hughes Tool Company. And the years from the 30s through World War II and on through, for a long period until the 50s, Howard is active in Hollywood, and many of you can get books and read about the studios he bought and his inventions and his flights and his hiring John Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R, who was fixing the admirals and generals up with women and getting defense contracts. He got his first government contract in 1943, just at the height of the war, when the Cold War is going to start, when the Nazis are going underground and retrenching for their next activities of World War III. and getting their top teams organized. Howard it has his aircraft in California. He gets $70 million to start making for the United States government. That's in 1943. By 1945, when the war is over, Project Paperclip begins. Those are the scientists that came over, Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger, and about 600 of the top German Nazi scientists with the rockets and missiles and the spy planes from Peenemünde. If you read Dora and read about the slave labor at their aircraft factories, these war criminals were released, and many of them were shipped to use aircraft in California, also to Muscle Shoals, Alabama, and Walter Dornberger goes out to Bell Helicraft, the Textron, he's in Dallas-Fort Worth area. But Paperclip brings over a hunk of Nazis, and also Richard Nixon, 1945 to 46, is active in helping to bring over these people before he runs, and is handpicked by Howard Hughes to run the House of Representatives out of California to defeat Jerry Voorhees, who is trying to explain I.G. Farben to the House of Representatives and break up the monopoly after the war of I.G. Farben that had the extermination camps, the company the Pope worked for at Auschwitz, the Solvay Chemical. In 1946, Richard Nixon is their candidate in the House of Representatives, and he's bringing in an influx of these people from Navy intelligence. John Meyer is getting contracts with the politicians and the generals. And by 1950, there's heavy military funding for the Hughes organization. In a one-time period, I think it was 1965 to 1975, they got $5 billion of the United States defense contracts and so forth. In 1953, the Secretary of the Air Force, Mr. Talbot, goes out to see Howard. Howard is very reckless. He's tested airplanes. He's been in a few crashes. He's with the Starlets. He is trying to set world records. He's totally unaccountable. He's a spoiled boy with a lot of money and a lot of contracts. And if you read Noah Dietrich's book on Howard Hughes, there's a very dramatic page in there, page 266, where the Secretary of Air Force, Talbot, comes out to see Howard. Now, Talbot had a brother who wanted a job at TWA, and Howard wouldn't give it to him. The brother had died. It doesn't say how, and he's mad at Howard anyway, and he says, to paraphrase it, or I can say it exactly, I don't give a damn about you. It says, we made a mistake to put the security of the United States in your hands, the entire security of the United States in your hands, and we don't give a damn about you. It will take at least a year to get rid of you and get this thing going. He says, at least a year. That's page 266 of the Noah Dietrich book. That was in 1953. Right after that visit, the Hughes Medical Institute is formed in Miami, far away from Hughes aircraft, the Hughes Medical Institute, and it's those doctors that are to see Howard and take care of his brain or his person or Vance Cooper's brain in Boston later. They set up this foundation, and Pat Hyland, Hyland, takes over the Hughes aircraft. Noah Dietrich's still in charge, and the Institute is formed not only to put the profits and get tax write-offs for Howard, not only for that, but then they declare Howard shortly afterwards mentally incompetent and take the away from him. He's by 1957, they declare him mentally incompetent, and they have put their top military into the Hughes organization. Now, Noah Dietrich had little Howard. He's grown up. He's had his kicks. He's living it up, getting his Army contracts, put his Richard Nixon in, funded him, donated $205,000 to Donald Nixon in 1956. Bill Gay comes in 1956. He's the beginning of the Mormon Mafia. I made a mistake last week when I was talking about Davis and mentioned that he was Terry Moore's driver. It was Bill Gay of the Mormon Mafia. It wasn't Chester Davis. He was in New York. And when Chester Davis passed away, I forgot it was Bill Gay who was the Mormon guard and brought in a team of Mormons to take care of Howard. The Institute is going, and Donald Nixon's gotten his loans. And by 1957 is one of the most important years in the area that I've studied and in Howard Hughes' life. And when you say Howard Hughes' life, that means in America for us too. Noah Dietrich, who was a man who manage the Hughes Tool Company, manage Howard Hughes and the activities, was fired. That was in 1957. He had worked for him 23 years when he was orphaned, and Noah Dietrich was fired. In 1957, when Dietrich was fired, was the year that they had the fake marriage to Jean Peters. It never existed. It existed on paper. No proof that Howard was there. And to give the excuse that Howard is alive or even screwing or doing what he was supposed to be doing, they brought in a woman who, at the end of her time period in 1970, when Howard literally has disappeared and gone, I believe, from this earth, she gets a divorce on paper. She got $26 million and has let a little bit out of this story. Also, Howard was supposed to be over on a Greek island and buried over there in 1971. Jackie Onassis at the time was married to Aristotle Onassis, and when she separated, she got the exact figure, $26 million. You can't say there's one upsmanship. Those women each got $26 million and had a finger in this piece. Noah Dietrich left in 1957, and Robert Mayu was brought in. He had been in Chicago with Mr. Guy Bannister. Robert Mayu was in the FBI. Guy Bannister is to open the company down in New Orleans where Lee Harvey Oswald had access through the back door. Guy Bannister worked with Lee Harvey Oswald. Mayu was in the CIA counterintelligence, and he worked with the CIA and the FBI, and he was from Boston. Chester Davis had gone to Harvard at Boston. Mayu was from Boston. Howard was taken to a Boston hospital, not any California hospital, from where he was never seen again. Howard was declared mentally incompetent in 1957. In 1957 was the meeting of the Mafia, the Appalachian Mafia meeting, where they decided how to divide up the United States and put it into separate little areas. And Howard was taken that year and literally taken over by the Mafia. And I'll share some more pages with you on the transition from the Gemstone Files, some transitions that it describes that meeting. Now, I knew about that Appalachian meeting. They had it on the Bobby Kennedy, Jimmy Hoffa scenes, the movie on TV. But I knew about the Appalachian meeting originally from Bruce Roberts in 1957. And Robert Mayu is to take over soon in 1960 as part of the Hughes organization and live at the home of Mo Dalitz and his old pal John Rosselli for organized crime, and Lucky Luciano, Bugsy Siegel, and the whole crime syndicate are part of the Robert Mayu FBI CIA team, as well as the Howard Hughes organization. Because when Dietrich is out, then the Howard Mayu comes in and the crime syndicate, and that's the transition period. Raymond Holliday is working for the Hughes Tool Company in Houston, and in 1960, just jumping a couple of years, is when Mr. Davis, Chester Davis, begins. Now, Ron Kiesler wrote a book and was on television, Keestler, 1957, 58, and 59. He was hired to be the only contact of Howard with the outside world. Howard was taken from his home, 15 rooms in Bel Air. He was at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He was literally later abducted. He was seen going in and out of the hotel drugged, and people thought he was crazy, that he wanted to be alone. He started to be drugged. And Howard was carried into the bungalow at the Beverly Hills Hotel and isolated where no friends could see him or call him. Robert Mayu started working for the Hughes organization. He never saw Howard in his life. Chester Davis claims he saw him once in London, but considering all the other lies, it's hard to believe that. The Hughes Tool Company, which Howard loved, which Howard inherited, which was his, was sold by Raymond Holliday in 1972 without seeing Howard Hughes. And even his secretary didn't see him. She didn't see him for 15 years, the last 15 years. And the Summa Corporation was formed without Howard's name on it. So Dietrich was fired in 1957. Mayu later is fired in 1970, and there's another transition. But by 1960, Mayu is brought in into the organization, and soon Howard is to be taken to Boston. 6 years later, in this time period, he's being drugged and taken care of, shown movies over and over, and he drinks Polish Perrier water. and eats chocolates, and his stomach and his head are completely off. Mayhew's brought in 1960. Chester Davis, the man we're talking about who passed away last week from Princeton and Harvard, starts working in 1960 and officially joins the team in 1960. And the years from 1960 to 66, Howard is, as I say, fed chocolates. I have a list of the movies he saw, the cinema. If you don't want to cry or laugh, I don't know which, or both, I'll read you a list of the movies in his daily schedule as it went on, the log of what happened to him. Now, in 1966, there was this big sale, the legal problems going on through the 60s of TWA. He lost it. He had $535 million, as I say, and they took him to a Boston hospital. Well, wouldn't you take anyone to a Boston hospital if you had $535 million? I mean, people kidnapped for $1 million. Can you imagine? $535 million cash sold TWA. And they move him to Las Vegas in the middle of the night, the heart of the mob, and then they begin buying up 5 casinos and real estate. Paul Laxalt was one of the selected people that the Hughes organization, you can't say Hughes, wanted for president of the United States. He's the campaign manager for the Republican Party now. He managed Ronald Reagan's state, and he's one of the people behind the scenes. Whoever wants Laxalt in gets Laxalt. He's there now and in the Senate, but very instrumental. And Howard was brought to Vegas in 1966 from the Boston hospital. And according to stories, he was on drugs 8 to 10 years. That's from going back to this time period of 1966. Now, in 1963, Robert Mayhew was working for the Howard Hughes organization. He was up to his ears in the organization. But when he started working in 1960 for the Hughes organization, he was meeting in New York and in Los Angeles to hire assassination teams. His old friend John Rosselli and Sam Giancana, the mobster, and people close to Frank Sinatra. He was working for the CIA. The alleged story was to kill Fidel Castro, but all these people were involved in the murder of John Kennedy. Castro is still alive, and as I said many times in this program, you know who's dead. It's John Kennedy. In 1960, Mayhew set up those teams. In 1963, Kennedy died. In 1968, Robert Kennedy was killed running against Richard Nixon, and Martin Luther King was killed a few months earlier, and Malcolm X a few months earlier. And in 1969 was Chappaquiddick. Mary Jo Kopechne was murdered, and the Watergate team and Mr. Hunt and Ulasewicz and McCord and the whole gang were in on the information and knowledge. The 1969 murder of Mary Jo Kopechne to keep Ted Kennedy from running against their friend Richard Nixon to make sure he would get the presidency. So these murders took place in the years that Robert Mayhew, FBI, CIA, counterintelligence, working with a crime syndicate, all friends of old Jack Ruby's who visited them in Las Vegas, etc., and worked with Carlos Marcelli and Santo Trafficante and the whole gang across the United States. Those Appalachian Nazi syndicates, the Genovese family, all tune in to the murder of John Kennedy and the connections to Vegas and to Robert Mayhew. So these murders were taking place, and Mayhew leaves after the Chappaquiddick. He's fired. He's on his own now. He's done what was supposed to be done, and he is fired. And then Howard is taken out of Vegas in 1970 by Intertel. Now, Intertel was an organization made of FBI and retired FBI and Interpol and CIA and Defense Department spies. They take over the gaming tables at Vegas, and they take Howard literally down to the Bahamas and keep him out of this country floating. We'll go into some of those details, but they're not so interesting until London and the Bahamas and Nicaragua and Vancouver and Mexico, and they keep him floating out of the United States now. Mayhew's done his job, and he's out. He gets a settlement of several $1 million plus, goodness knows what. And Intertel takes Howard, and there's a lot of discussion if Howard is alive or not. They're beginning to suspect the IRS, the various people in the government. Before Watergate in 1972 and 71, there was a lot of discussion, is Howard alive? So January the 7th, 1972, Howard made a radio broadcast telephone conversation, and I have a record of that if you'd like me to play it some night on World Watcher so you can tape it and own it because it's impossible to buy it. And hear him fumbling the questions, and then we could analyze them. Maybe sometime if I'm out of town for the week, we can get that put on and then discuss it later, or I'll put it on for you, because it is the actual record of Howard's interview to prove that he's alive, and he can't answer the most simple questions. And then it caused more questions to be asked than were asked before, and handpicked people to ask the questions. And then this voice with a computer of every question of his life filled in. He's supposed to answer them. Now, the Summa Corporation was formed in 1972. The Clifford Irving hoax came out. Allegedly, these were letters written by Howard that McGraw-Hill and Life magazine claimed were in fact Howard's, and they were not Howard Hughes. And I think the whole purpose of the hoax was to surface and let Howard and the Rosemont Corporation sue to prove that they reacted, instead of the federal government going in and looking at Howard Hughes and insisting, look, we've given you $5 billion. That's how many $1 million of contracts and all these defense pieces of equipment, etc. We want to see who we're giving them to. He was still a blind object in hotels with boards over the window and black curtains over those in case an airplane with a camera went through the windows. He was in rooms, and they took the floor above and the floor below of every hotel he stayed in, and Daniel Ludwig, another mystery man, owned the hotels, the Xanadu Hotel in the Bahamas and one in Mexico. The Hughes organizations bought them from him, built their own runways for their airplanes, and as I said, the elevator buttons were taken off, the guards were at the door, nobody could get through or see, and the windows were boarded up, and that was it. So Howard was moved from these various places. In 1972, his tool company was sold for $150 million. The Summa Corporation was formed without his name on it, never had Howard's name on it, in San Fernando Valley. He allegedly was in London. Whoever was there had broken his hip and was there. In 1974, there was a burglary of Summa Corporation in California involving the LAPD and various people because allegedly Howard's will, Bobby Hall, who was soon to be murdered, said that Howard's will was located there. And if they did away with the will, more people, and particularly Chester Davis and that gang, were able to draw a lot of money. Next week, I'll read you some of the millions of dollars, at 40 or 50 million, they drew the last 5 or 6 months at this corpse of 90 pounds with needles through its body, lying in a bed in Bahamas and Mexico. And they're drawing $40, $50 million at the time, just siphoning money off and never having to account for it. Well, Howard was a political animal. They built the Glomar Explorer that was used down at the time Allende was murdered in Chile for government spying. I'll do more later, but Chester Davis died last week, hardly any notice, and his role with Howard, with the financing, with the Medical Institute, with the assassination teams, will do more. As I say, this is the anniversary of Kennedy's death. And if you want to know who killed John Kennedy, start with the Howard Hughes organization, and we'll fill in the details and do some more on that next week. In the meantime, our time is up, so I have to say goodbye. It goes fast for me. I don't know about you. It's Mae Brussell on KAZU-FM in Pacific Grove, California.